Hello and welcome to our webcast. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's webcast, Recognize Common Fraud Schemes Targeting Local Governments. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now, I would like to introduce today's presenters, Tammy Lohr and Ritchie, both senior managers here at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your console if you would like more information. Now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Chelsea to get the presentation started. Chelsea.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Welcome, everybody. We are so happy you are here today. Just wanted to give a brief agenda of the different topics that we're going to discuss. So first, we're going to go into just an overall introduction to some very basic fraud concepts, but very good to be reminiscent of and a nice reminder. Then we're going to go into fraud in local government, talk about some statistics. Then we'll talk about some common fraud schemes, which is a lot of fun. We have some good current examples to provide to you all today. And then lastly, we are going to end with fraud detection and prevention strategies. So once again, welcome. And I guess I'll get us kicked off here. So we're just going to go into an introduction of some basic fraud concepts. So, what is fraud? And I think it's really important to remember that there can be different types of fraud that can happen in your organization. But fraud really is the essentially intentional deception that results in financial or personal gain. And one of the key things that differentiates fraud from error is that fraud must be proven as intentional. So it really is that example of, that missing zero in a financial statement. Was that fraud or versus that human error? So a really basic concept to remember when thinking about fraud. And, fraud can really be committed internally or externally. When fraud is committed by an employee or members of governing bodies within your organization, this is internal fraud. And it's really the name that we like to refer to it as is occupational fraud. And so that's when someone uses their job for personal gain beyond their earned compensation. And today we're going to really focus and hone in on internal fraud schemes that are really common in local governments. But I think it's also important to note that fraud can be committed both by external parties, such as vendors, customers, even residents will be relevant for this group when we're talking about local government. And then another main area in this is cyber criminals. And we actually recently had a cybersecurity webcast that you can go back and watch that if you're really interested in learning more about that specific type of fraud and how to protect your organization from cyber attacks. I feel like that is coming up more and more frequently. So, very, very good thing to look out for. But with that, let's go into the fraud triangle. And, the fraud triangle is the most widely accepted model for explaining why people commit fraud. And I'm going to start at the very top of this triangle, and that is where we have pressure. So what motivates the crime in the first place? An employee might have some financial problem that really can't be solved through legitimate means. So they start committing illegal acts. So problems can be personal, inability to pay bills, if they have a contentious divorce, a drug or gambling addiction, medical bills, that sort of thing. Another thing to think about when talking about pressure is that professional ambitions can also create that type of pressure. So you want to show, that you're in a really good financial position to maintain, a certain bond rating, or you really need that next grant to keep going. So you falsify data or elements of reporting. So that is pressure. Then going down to the bottom left corner of the triangle, that is where we're going to find rationalization. And so fraudsters often justify their crimes to themselves. I was only borrowing the money. I was entitled to the money. I was underpaid. My employer's cheating me. They owed me that money. And I know this is a really dorky example, and I'm just going to bring myself to that as a CPA. But I always think of The Emperor's New Groove when I'm thinking about rationalization. And I don't know if you have ever seen that movie. There is a little devil on one shoulder who's always encouraging Kronk to do something bad. And then on the other side of his shoulder is an angel who is saying, like, no, you really shouldn't do that. But of course, the devil always wins and does a one-armed, I think, handstand. And the angel concedes, he's never going to win. And that devil is always going to be right, even though it's clearly an irrelevant point to an issue at the end. So I always think rationalization, you can always work your way into that rationalization. And so with that cheesy example, I am going to go into the very last element of the fraud triangle, which is opportunity. And so fraudsters see an opportunity to commit the crime. They'll abuse their position of trust to solve a problem with a low perceived risk of getting caught. And so, this is what we see a lot in local governments. And so thinking about this, having access to blank checks, lack of segregation of duties. In particular, easy ones are purchasing or creating vendor accounts. No one's double checking those payroll records. And we're going to get into that later on today. But these are some really, key elements to think about that opportunity that might exist in your organization. And really there's a lot of ways that this can show up, but it really is always going to relate to internal control weaknesses and a low perception of that detection. So both of these are really key to preventing fraud within your organization. And so one of the reasons that we really encourage our clients to actually develop a formal fraud program, and Tammy, I think you're going to talk about that later on, is to increase that risk of detection. So think of it like, a cop on the side of the highway. You're definitely going to slow down to avoid that ticket if you see that cop. And so actively thinking about that in relation to fraud, setting up a fraud, waste, and abuse program to report, allegations will really help deter people from committing fraud, just like a cop on the side of the highway deters people from speeding. Tammy?
Great. So now we're going to transition into talking specifically about fraud in local government. And all of the statistics that we'll be reviewing with you all today come from the 2024 Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report to the nations. I'm going to call that the ACFE for everyone's sake, including myself. But they do a survey every 2 years to understand fraud trends across industries, and they sort of break it out into those different industries. And so we're really excited to be able to share that information with you. This was really just released a couple of months ago. And so it's really interesting information. And it's also able to be trended over several years, which you'll also see in some of these statistics. So according to the ACFE, local governments experienced about 23% of all occupational fraud in government organizations over the last 2 years. As you can see, that's a bit less than state governments, but local governments have a much higher median loss at $148,000 per instance. And by the way, that has increased by almost $25,000 in the last 2 years. And that's pretty substantial if we think about the percentage increase that happened there. So a lot of people working in local government, people in local government, people in school districts and special purpose districts, they're working there because they really care about the organization, about its mission and vision. And you have that assumption about yourself and all of your colleagues, which is good. But because of that, sometimes we'll think, oh, fraud couldn't happen with my organization. It would never happen here. But unfortunately, the statistics indicate otherwise. So we just want to be able to review these trends with you all and help you understand what are the things to really be looking out for and to implement in order to reduce the risk of fraud happening at your organization. So with that, we wanted to have our first polling question. And so we want to see what you all think is the most common fraud scheme in local government. This is not an exam, but we're really curious about what you all think, especially with the overlay of COVID-19 over the last 2 years. That was very prevalent through a lot of these different fraud schemes. So some of the options here are expense reimbursement, where you may be inflating expenses, payroll schemes, so creating ghost employees and things like that. Corruption, so that one's sort of self-explanatory, usually has to do with elected officials and things like that. Non-cash is essentially when you're stealing goods rather than money. And then billing schemes, which were certainly potentially more popular if we think about the creation of a lot of new vendors in order to do these different things during the pandemic. So we want to hear from you on what you think was most common. Chelsea, what would you say if you didn't know what was on the next slide?
I would say expense reimbursement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chelsea's clearly done a lot of audits on expense reimbursement. And the audience agrees with you. So about half of you think expense reimbursement is the most common fraud scheme. And then it looks like billing is next. And only 13% of you think that it would be corruption. So drum roll, please. Okay, so that was my drum roll. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the most common scheme is corruption, with a whopping 52% of all fraud schemes involving corruption. You can see that that has slightly decreased since 2022, but still it's prevalent in more than half of all fraud cases. The next most common scheme is billing, which is, as you can see, increasing facing, and we'll sort of allude to why that might be, in particular with the influx of resources that went out to local organizations during the pandemic, and sort of the need to spend all that money on a timeline and use new vendors to be able to do that. That created a lot more opportunity for billing schemes to take place. Followed by that is non-cash schemes, so that's again stealing stuff rather than money, and payroll schemes with expense reimbursement only at 15%. So I'm glad that you're all here today. Hopefully this will be very interesting for you to learn about some of these different schemes and go through some examples of how they really show up in government. Chelsea will be reviewing that in a little bit later of today's presentation. So before we move on, though, I do want to note that Chelsea and I do both work at Moss Adams and are at an accounting firm, and we know that these columns don't equal 100%, I promise you. But the reason for that is that you can have one fraud scheme that has multiple of these different elements in it. So you could have corruption and billing. And so that's why it's not going to equal to 100%. So just wanted to point that out for those of you who are math inclined. I promise we can count to 100. So let's talk about who commits occupational fraud in government. These are some of the trends that were noted by the ACFE. So about 40% of fraud is actually completed by people with 1 to 5 years of experience in your organization. Do tend to have a higher median loss at $183,000 per employees. Also account for about half of all fraud incidents, but they tend to have overall lower losses. And then in terms of position, it's pretty evenly split between employees and managers, although managers have almost 5 times the median loss as an employee, likely because they have greater access to override or to circumvent internal controls, as well as that greater decision-making authority. Executives account for just about 20% of all fraud, but they end up having the highest median loss of any employee group, as you can see here. Additionally, about 2/3 of occupational fraudsters have a university degree or higher. Fraudsters without a university degree tended to create lower losses. And so what this slide is really showing is the more educated you are, the higher the median loss is that you are likely to cause at your organization. Additionally, about half of frauds in this study were carried out by multiple perpetrators, actually colluding together. So the schemes that were committed by just one person had a lower median loss of $74,000, whereas schemes with 2 perpetrators had median losses of $135,000. And then if you had 3 or more perpetrators, you were at $329,000. So there does appear to be sort of an exponential impact to have more and more people involved in executing that scheme. That's what this is really showing. What's also notable here is that about 87% of the people who committed fraud had no related criminal background or prior employment disciplinary action. So overall, 41% of all occupational frauds were not reported to law enforcement. And that is across all industries. That is not specific to government. We'll show you the government-specific incidents, which government tends to actually report fraud to law enforcement, probably because you are relying on taxpayer dollars. But in general, many organizations won't report it because of the reputational risk that it presents. And then committed fraud in one organization who was just let go, and then they go to another organization, they're able to repeat that scheme. So reporting it to law enforcement is certainly a best practice that we would recommend. And then men commit more frauds than women. About 3/4 of all frauds are committed by men, and those men do also tend to create higher median losses. So we're going to have a couple of slides that talk about this larger question of how did COVID-19 really change the risk landscape for fraud? So in 53% of all cases in the 2024 report to the nations, there was at least one pandemic-related factor that contributed to that fraud occurring. So the pandemic certainly was impactful, and some of the reasons why are shown here. So some of the factors that really impacted fraud risk were changes in organizational staffing. So roles and responsibilities shifted during the pandemic. People were given new access to new different functions, or they might have been taking on new roles because someone had left the organization or was unavailable to work, and there may not have been any backup for that role. So it really exposed a lot of those sort of sole contributor positions and someone else needing to step in. And so that created an opportunity for fraud to take place. There was also that shift to remote work. I know that freaked out a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic, and people thought, oh my gosh, we're going to see huge instances of fraud as a result of switching to remote work. And so certainly there was an impact, but it may not have been as large as what a lot of people had anticipated. And that really depended on how each organization was using technology prior to the pandemic and how they were able to actually do that shift to remote work as well. One of the ways that remote work did sort of show up as a risk factor was just being able to verify vendor accounts. So if your vendors had employees who were working from home, then they may not be available at the office phone number, and they instead had to give you their personal information. And so we saw a lot of organizations that had sort of said, oh, okay, I'm calling Office Depot to verify their banking information. Their sales Sandra went ahead and sent me her personal phone number, but that was actually social engineering. And Sandra was, in fact, a fraudster. And so that money that you meant to pay to Office Depot, in fact, went to Sandra instead of Office Depot. So just one of the ways that shift to remote work sort of showed up for some of our clients over the last couple of years. And one other component that is not listed here, but was also impactful to a lot of local governments, was just that sudden influx of grant dollars with a timeline to be able to spend that money. So you may not have had the staffing in procurement or grants or contracts to be able to absorb all of that workload. So you had an increase in workload. Those positions are pretty notoriously challenging to fill. And so there was certainly more opportunity for fraud as a result of that as well. So not on the slide, but something that anecdotally we have experienced as internal auditors for local governments. Another impact of COVID was an increase in the overall median losses. So the overall median loss of frauds that occurred during the pandemic increased by 24% between the 2022 report and the 2024 report, even though the time to detection didn't change. So you have the same period to be able to commit the fraud, but the actual dollar amount that was siphoned away from your organization had increased. And this also follows a period where that median loss had been declining over several years, and then it shot up by about $25,000. So as you can see here, that was really driven by an increase in median losses from financial statement fraud, corruption, and from asset misappropriation. Again, there was just greater opportunity because of all of these different shifts. And there was also a greater payoff for those fraud schemes during the pandemic for a number of organizations, especially in the public sector. This slide is showing you the top concealment methods used by fraudsters. So these are things to really look out for and just be aware of in terms of how people are sort of covering up their frauds. And so, people are altering or creating documents that are physical or electronic, or they might be destroying or withholding those documents. And what I think is interesting here is that if you go to the bottom of the slide, most of the fraud concealment is still happening on physical documents. So even though many organizations have shifted to more electronic documents, more electronic processing of transactions, the fraud trends still show that physical documents are leading the charge in terms of how that fraud is being concealed. So that's just interesting. Obviously, electronic documents closely follow that, but those physical documents are still at the forefront. And this is one of my favorite slides. So here we're showing you the most common warning signs of fraud based on an employee's behavior. So 84% of all fraudsters display at least one of these behavioral red flags. And some of these most common red flags were 39% of fraudsters were living beyond their means. So is someone driving around in one of those new Tesla Cyberchip, and like, does that make sense for what you know about them and their compensation? Interestingly enough, in sort of the fraud circles, there's this running joke around Disney theme parks and how often someone goes to Disney theme parks with their family as a correlation with fraud as well. So just paying attention to what are the vacations they're going on. Does that make sense for them? What does their Cybertruck look like? Things like that. 27% of fraudsters had financial difficulty. Chelsea covered those in that pressure component of the fraud triangle. So those are things like addiction or family troubles, medical bills, kids going to college. FAFSA wasn't really working for many people this year. And so those are some of just the examples of that other behavioral red flag. And then 20% of fraudsters had a close relationship with a vendor. So if you have a construction company that you are working with on a renovation for a library, for example, is the project manager seen out on that contractor's, a bottle of what do those relationships look like? Not only is that a risk from a fraud perspective, that's also a perception risk to make sure that you're maintaining that strong independence. I'll turn it back over to Chelsea to get into some more schemes.
Thank you, Tammy. This is really like my favorite part of this presentation because, Tammy really highlighted the different types of schemes, and we're going to kind of hone in on a couple that are really prevalent. So like you said, Tammy, first one, corruption. So corruption is the wrongful use of influence for personal gain. And I think when I look at the fraud triangle, I really think a lot about opportunity in this area. So, there's lack of segregation of duties. The tone at the top is kind of crumbling. So this can be, bribery, kickbacks, illegal, extortion, collusion, that sort of thing. And bribery and kickback schemes are notoriously difficult to detect. You just can't go in and take a look at your own organization's transactions to detect these. So this is, it really takes whistleblowers or, a specific internal audit sometimes for these corruption, schemes. And so really, how do you avoid this corruption? I think realistically, it comes down to good leadership and, having good ethics. But you also need to take a look at your internal controls. And I think in making sure that you have appropriate safeguards in place, is going to really help. But corruption still can, infiltrate in your internal control environment. One of the avoidance techniques here really is, like I had mentioned before, increasing that perception of detection. Realistically, that is a great way to reduce that corruption. If people think that they're going to be watched and called out for inappropriate behavior, they are less likely going to continue behaving that way. Corruption is usually detected, like I mentioned, by whistleblowers, although sometimes those audits can identify, areas where something like a purchasing anomaly or something could be happening. So just something to watch out for. Now, this is the best part. We're going into our examples. So this example, this was by the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission. And so it was recently revealed by a employee, so whistleblower, that it has been a long-standing practice of staff, including the agency director, of obtaining rare bottles of liquor. So Steve Marks, he was actually the leader of the agency. He was very frank with the investigators once they called him out, and he said that he requested staff to divert warehoused liquor to a certain store where he could purchase it or other administration can purchase it. And, obviously the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, they are a monopoly in Oregon on, liquor sales in the state. So some of the in-demand liquor was set aside so that those managers could purchase it in a specific location. And I'm not sure if anybody has ever heard of Van Winkle's 23-year-old whiskey, but that was one of the main, it's a very expensive whiskey, very rare, and that was one of the main culprits that, staff were saying that they were continuously doing over and over again to take it to a certain store. So Mark was actually asked to resign. And then the governor kind of looked further into this, talking to her commission about it, and the entire administration for the commission actually resigned afterwards. So pretty crazy corruption. Okay, so going into billing schemes, these are very common and they can be costly as well. They usually are to generate cash, but they're also to get goods and services for personal use. Very common, but the good thing about billing schemes is that, they're usually easier to detect because there's an audit trail that, you can kind of follow in these types of schemes. So, one scheme in a billing scheme would be that the perpetrator creates false support for a fraudulent purchase. So they create a false invoice, PO, requisition, receiving report, that sort of thing. Another is when they will arrange for overpayment of a vendor. So, they'll look at, they'll pocket that overpayment. They'll pay the vendor, but then pocket the remaining overpayment to themselves. And these are usually put into a shell company. So it wouldn't be to directly them. They're not that brazen and bold, but they will put it into a shell company to kind of keep everybody off track. Another one is they can create a personal purchase and then bill it to the employer. So more common is with credit cards. And we'll talk about that here shortly. But, I think, again, really, what are the avoidance techniques here? Internal controls. So making sure that you have internal controls and segregation of duties, especially around those purchasing and payment functions. Those are really easy. If the wrong hands are in there, that's an easy way for people to commit fraud. And then, detection techniques. If there's unusual payments or payees, raise the question, dig a little further into that, as well as looking, does this site visits for vendors, does this place actually exist, and so on and so forth. So with that, let's go into some examples of billing schemes. So one was over in Stockton. So Angel Flores was the center of a search warrant served at her home back in this past November. And the sheriff's office had been actually investigating the district since last April. And after a report found evidence, of fraud and financial mismanagement. So, this was over the school district board. And so all 7 board members had their credit cards analyzed, their district cards analyzed. And it was determined that actually Flores intentionally used hers for her own personal gain. Everyone else was in compliance, but they found that over the year in 2023, she had assigned over $1,000 worth of gas alone to the credit card, and knowing that it was not allowed. That was not part of the purchasing policy. And she was also accused of purchasing food, that sort of thing. The article goes into, she was also had some insurance claims on her and whatnot. So she was actually, she had 4 charges against her. So grand theft of money was one, theft of public funds, and her bail at the time of this article was currently set at $175,000. And then, looking at Multnomah, so this county employee was working in a residential assistant program, and they attempted to divert thousands of dollars in rental assistance to their own bank account. And you're like, how the heck could they have done this? And so what they had done, and actually the county auditor's office found out about this, they had the former employee had successfully embezzled at least $20,000 in a couple of years. And she had been using a family member for this. So she was having the family member apply for rental assistance through the agency that the employee oversaw, but her landlord was this employee. So currently the employee is no longer working at the county, thank goodness, and she is still also under investigation. So moving along, going into some non-cash schemes. So this is really where a scheme in which an employee steal or misuses non-cash assets, from the organization. So they might be stealing inventory from a warehouse or storeroom, that sort of thing. Once again, looking at different types of techniques here, segregation of duties. So, how do we do this? Policies and procedures, having a third party come and look at your segregation of duties, do an internal control review to really show you, where you stand and, recommendations. So, detection techniques here, regular and random inventory counts can also be done, as well as, ongoing monitoring of IT and as well as physical controls. So looking at some non-cash schemes, there is a couple here. I think I'm going to go over just one right now, just for time's sake. But that was over the Philadelphia Water Department. So in 2017 and 2018, this employee actually was accessed computer inventory control system without authorization. And they used the login credentials associated with employees that did have supervision into a storeroom. And this employee created false entries into the electronic records to justify removing materials. Some types of materials were bulk wire, copper from the storeroom, that sort of thing. So high expensive items. And then they physically took the materials from the department's inventory and then transported them to the local scrap yards, sold them in excess of $150,000 before he was caught. The problem with this, there's many problems with this, but really what the department was really worried about is that they received millions of dollars in federal funds and assistance annually. So this was going to be a huge thing, at a federal level. The FBI was brought in, as well as Philadelphia's Office of Inspector General. And about I thought this was interesting, about 75% of those investigations are started by complaints brought by city employees. So having that whistleblower, at your front door, that is how, a lot of these complaints are even brought to light. So the employee was guilty of multiple counts of theft, including that federally funded program. He was ordered to pay $153,000 in restitution, and he also was sentenced to 14 months in prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. So really crazy. There still is, another article here. So I did want to give you that, please look into that one afterwards. But we're going to keep moving on here. Okay, so payroll schemes. This is a big one, especially for big cities, big counties. If you have less than 50 employees, it's something to look out for, but I don't think it's as prevalent. So just wanted to, kind of point it out there. So what types of schemes can be in payroll schemes? One is having ghost employees. So a ghost employee is created in your payroll system. They're going to create a fake employee and then pocket the money that is distributed to that non-existent worker. Another one that I guarantee we all know about is timesheet fraud. And this is so prevalent in so many of the clients that I have worked with over the years. And so this is when wages are falsified, and so they can be lying on their timesheets, taking advantage of commission loopholes, or inflating expense reports. More savvy people have even been known to be able to break into the payroll system and assign like an unearned bonus to themselves. That has definitely happened once or twice. I have seen that in my career. Some other common areas in these would be like having, buddy punching, where one employee will help another employee out when they're, not working, that sort of thing. So just some things to be aware of when looking at payroll schemes. Another one would be looking at fake workers' compensation claims. And we always think about workers' compensation claims as, someone in the construction or, out on the field. But really, it could be somebody that slips and falls in the break room. So another really important thing to look at. So going into these different examples, I think I'm going to highlight the Syracuse schools. So the Syracuse School District, they had operated this Twilight program. So it was for students that were trying to get their degree, and it was in the evening time. And so, it was this highly, once again, grant program. And what was happening is that, one, teachers were creating fake students to make it look like the students were filling the classes, as well as, falsifying their timesheets as well. So this did get into litigation. So 2 teachers actually pleaded guilty around this, one to a non-criminal violation, which actually helped them. And then there's still 2 other cases that are still pending to this day, including the case against the district. So this not only was hit on the employees, but then it was also the district because of, the lack of segregation of duties, lack of controls that they had in this area. So something to kind of also point out is the risk that your organization as a whole could be liable to in these fraud schemes. All right. Last but not least, this is my favorite one. I think that the rest of the members, at least 42% of them also believed that, Tammy, and that's expense reimbursement schemes. I see this time and time again. And actually, my very first audit as a staff years and years ago, I actually found expense reimbursement, an expense reimbursement scheme, fraudulent scheme. So it happens to the best of us. So there's different ways that this can happen. One, the expenses never occurred, so they're fictitious. So examples of this would be claiming mileage that never incurred, or inflating the mileage that was incurred. Claiming meals paid by other parties and then claiming it for yourself. Another thing is you can have altered expenses. So altering the amount or date of the expense incurred, altering the identities of the people entertained. So instead of, it being family members, having coworkers instead. Another really good example of expense reimbursement schemes is mischaracterization. So expenses incurred by the employee are not eligible for reimbursement. And, usually the employee knows it, right? Because we know that means that they had intention for this. So, disguising alcohol for meals, that's a huge one that we see, especially when looking at grants and the expense allocations that are allowed around grants, as well as claiming gifts as meals. That's another one that I thought was interesting to point out when thinking about how people could mischaracterize these. So going into some examples, I have to tell you, I'm going to go and talk about the Lee's Summit, Missouri one, but I think you have to look at this potential service employee's sentence for fraudulent claims. I will tell you this one, there was over $700,000 of misappropriation and expense reimbursement by the fire department. And it's a lengthy article, but I really encourage you to read it because it's insane that such things can actually happen. So really wanted to look into it. But looking at this, Lee's Summit, this was a big one because it really kind of, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the expense reimbursement is for travel. There's a lot of that's, where it can be a lot of issues. And so this woman, she actually had over almost $30,000 in travel reimbursements that were fake. And she was actually going to see her son out of country. Now she worked for the Postal Service. So this was a big one. And so she was actually, she was sentenced by the US district. And she had to go into 3 months in federal prison without parole, as well as pay back all of the funds. So really big things that can happen in this area. So, okay, I know everyone's looking, where is that poll number 2? So here we go. Have you ever seen one of these schemes take place at your agency? Yes or no? And I would hope to think that people would say no, but what do you think, Tammy?
I think it depends. And I know that we have some folks from the West Coast here, and we have some Oregon examples that we went through, and I live in Oregon. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see some yeses, as well as quite a few of I don't knows, because again, it sort of depends on how that organization wants to handle the fraud event. Are they going to report it to law enforcement? And so if your organization does report things to law enforcement, then you're going to know about it. But there still might be fraud schemes that are more minor that are detected, and then that employee is just shown the door, so to speak.
Yeah.
It could be an I don't know.
Wow. Well, this is, we're off. I mean, this is good. So, a lot of no's, which is great. Hopefully you have those segregation of duties and internal controls in place, and you take these webcasts so you know all about these fraud schemes. Okay. All right. Well, we are going to move on.
Yeah. So I wish we had a polling question here of just like, what is your faith in humanity? Like very good, not so good, like terrible. But let's transition from the doom and gloom into some proactive strategies that you can take to help prevent and detect fraud in your organization. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about is just developing a fraud risk management program. This is something that Chelsea and I do all the time for our clients in government. It's really important. It's very near and dear to our hearts. And so this essentially provides a way to really allow for employees and members of the public to report activities that could be perceived to be fraud, waste, or abuse. And really the objective is to increase the perception of detection of fraud so that it deters employees from committing fraud in the first place, as well as to think through if there is fraud happening, we want to be able to detect that sooner because there is a close relationship. The longer a fraud goes on, the higher your median losses tend to be. So this program, it really aims to achieve all of those different factors and help prevent future losses through that proactive risk management of fraud. And these are, engagements that Chelsea and I do often as standalone engagements or as part of our internal audit work with local government clients. And this chart is showing some common anti-fraud controls that organizations have in place, really with that goal to deter fraud, reduce potential losses, detect fraud more quickly. Some of these controls are very common in local government, even required like an external audit of your financial statements. So that's the good news. So it's really important, especially for all of you who are on the line who are in government to make sure that you are being good stewards of public dollars, and also for the reputation of your organization. So you don't have shareholders, but you have people that rely on you to deliver core services and enhance their quality of life, their livability, their sense of community. And so really thinking through these controls is really key. One of the other controls that I wanted to point out that is worth noting is just having an internal audit function. So if your organization doesn't have an internal audit function, we really would recommend that you implement one, not only to be able to prevent and detect fraud, but also to have that independent look at your internal controls, your policies, your procedures, the overall efficiency of your organization. If you don't have that function, we'd love to talk to you, help you get that set up. It's really key to helping prevent fraud from happening in your organization, and we'll show you some more reasons why. These are the anti-fraud controls with the largest % reduction of median loss. So this is where, again, internal audit comes in. So you see surprise audits, management review, that proactive data monitoring and analysis. Those are things that are typically done by internal audit. You have a significant % reduction in the median loss if you have those different controls in place. And those are primarily more detective, those pieces. In addition, internal audit will usually oversee your hotline as well as provide fraud training for your employees as well as your elected officials. And so all of these, again, are sort of highlighting the importance of having that internal audit function, which is also independent. And so it gives additional credence to some of these activities. Of course, people at different levels of the organization have different pressures and opportunities to engage in fraud. This is really showing that breakdown. So you have, at every level, you have a substantial amount of opportunity, weaknesses at the employee, manager, and owner level around those internal controls. Again, that's what internal audit is there to help you with. Do an internal controls review, help you shore up those controls, and reduce the opportunity portion of that fraud triangle. All right, we're on our third polling question. We want to know how many of you have a hotline where employees can report suspected fraud, waste, or abuse. You'll see in some of our future slides why this is really important. It's a very low-cost way to be able to help prevent and detect fraud. And this has been something that's been proven over and over again in these report to the nations by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And so it's not new information, but it's really, really valuable to have this hotline as well as to have employee training. And I know most of our clients, Chelsea, we end up managing and implementing this hotline with them.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, good. So most of you do. Those of you who said, I don't know, I encourage you to find out, because I think that that goes to this idea of just having the hotline isn't enough. We also need to make sure that people are aware of it and have that training as well. So speaking of that, here we wanted to, it's a little bit of a busy slide, but really what this is showing you is that there is a very close relationship between the overall median loss of a fraud scheme and the time to detection. So there's very much a sort of clear line there. And then at the x-axis, you can see all those different detection mechanisms that we really had talked about. So, you know, if you're looking at the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that surveillance, monitoring, automated transaction analysis, those are some of the quickest ways to identify potential fraud. And those schemes do tend to have lower losses as a result of that. This is really interesting to me as a fraud nerd, as a government nerd. I'm interested to see how this changes over time as AI becomes more and more prevalent and easier to use for a lot of organizations. I would imagine that those controls start to increase and that we might see a reduction in some of those losses, and that the prevalence of that detective control could also increase. So these are some of the ways that fraud is detected. One of the reasons we were highlighting that hotline is that it is the #1 way that frauds are detected by a pretty significant amount. That next highest category is, of course, internal audit. So according to the ACFE, 43% of frauds are detected through a hotline, and most of those tips, over half of them, are provided by employees. So having a hotline has been shown to decrease the duration of frauds. It has reduced the overall median losses. Again, they're a great low-cost way to detect and quickly respond to potential fraud in your organization. So with this hotline, some reports are, of course, submitted informally to people within the organization rather than through that formal reporting mechanism. As you can see here, direct supervisors are the #1 way that most whistleblowers would report if they weren't using the hotline. And so that's also just really honing in on why it's important to make sure that all of your employees have access to fraud training, that they know what to do if that type of complaint comes their way, and really making sure that they know how to use the hotline, and that you have that percentage of people who say, I don't know if my organization has this hotline, can really be reduced. And this slide shows some government-specific information. So within government, tips are still the most common way that fraud is detected. The frequency of detection by internal audit is actually higher than the overall industries put together. So it's at 18%, which is a little bit higher. And then, of course, management reviews, which are also often done by sort of internal audit. And what's interesting on the bottom half of the slide is that governments are far more likely to refer cases to law enforcement. So 73% of the frauds that occurred in government were referred to law enforcement, which is good because that helps prevent that individual from moving on to another organization and committing that fraud. Maybe if they were working at the city, maybe they go to the county, or your neighboring city or your neighboring county. And so we want to be able to avoid that. And then providing annual fraud awareness training to employees and managers also really helps to increase the detection of that potential fraud in your organization. What this slide is really showing is that there's a higher likelihood that employees will report that suspected fraud if they are well trained on it. We recommend annual training, refresher training, this type of training that goes over trends over the last 2 years. And so we just want to make sure that people are really aware of this and aware of whether their organization has a hotline as well. So with that, we're going to have our last polling question. Based on all this, we wanted to see if you know now which anti-fraud controls you want to put into place at your agency. We've gone through quite a few of those different anti-fraud controls today. So Chelsea, what do you think is the most important thing to have?
You know, I think policies and procedures and training on those policies and procedures is really important, as well as having a fraud hotline. I think those two are like top notch for sure. What about you?
Yeah. I think it's really having that internal audit function to be able to do that kind of work for your organization. And I saw on our registration list that there are quite a few internal auditors on the line, which is very encouraging. So we wanted to just highlight that, since that's who's going to be looking at your policies, procedures, your internal control reviews, doing that proactive data analysis. So it's very important.
Let's see here.
It looks like there are some of you that are having trouble with the polls. Please be sure that your slides are open. They are showing up within the slides. So if you take a look towards the bottom of your screen at the widgets, please select the slides, and that should help your view. If not, please refresh your screen, and you should be able to see them. And we'll keep this open for another few seconds while you all are trying to get to our poll question here. Again, if you're having a hard time seeing the polling question, please open up those slides or refresh your screen. We'll leave this open for just a few more seconds.
It looks like we got an increase in the number of people participating in the poll, so we're glad that we were able to get that sorted for y'all.
Great. And for those of you having issues with that last poll and you do need that final polling question, please submit it through that Q&A and we will forward to the results.
Okay, great. Danielle, you can go ahead and close us out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tammy and Chelsea, for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us as we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Tammy or Chelsea directly. Their contact information is in your console. Also, I would like to draw attention to the image in the upper right-hand corner of your console. Click this to be taken to more information on our upcoming Uniform Guidance webcast, which will be July 11th. Hopefully you can join us for that one as well. And if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any trouble downloading it now. And finally, up here we have the link to an online survey for today's presentation. Thank you for joining our webcast, and we hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you, everybody.